Okay, I think it's 5:05, so we gave some courtesy minutes to the attendees, but we will start. So first of all, welcome everyone to this new Alter 5 webinar, and good afternoon. It is great to see so many people connected. I guess this is a topic of growing relevance in the market, and a lot of investors and sponsors, developers are looking at it with a lot of interest. My name is Miguel Solana, and I am I'm a partner at Alter 5. As many of you know, Alter 5 is a platform that provides institutional investors with debt and equity investment opportunities in renewable energy assets. This can be debt investors or financial institutions seeking project financing opportunities, or equity investors looking to acquire projects under development or ready to build or in operation. Today's webinar, as you all know, is about curtailment. And as I was saying, is a topic of growing importance for investors, given the increased relevance of solar PV within the Spanish generation mix. There are ongoing discussions about potential cannibalization and excess supply of solar energy that may affect the sector as a whole. So to shed some light on this matter, we are pleased to have Ana Varillas, head of Iberia and LATAM, and Alexandre Dantin, research lead for France and Iberia, both at Aurora Energy Research, which is one of the top energy consultants, as our speakers. So Ana, Alexandre, welcome to the seminar. The idea that we had in mind is for Ana to introduce the topic and some of the key issues around the curtailment, for then Alexander to get into more detailed analysis, more technical, and then open the floor for questions. You can start sending your questions through Zoom, and we will be creating a list to then have a more interactive discussion. But now I will give the floor to Ana to start explaining and giving some light on this.
Thanks, Miguel. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining. As Miguel said, I'm Ana Varillas, head of Iberia and LATAM. So just very briefly, for those of you that may have lost a little bit of track of where Aurora is and what we're doing, we're an energy market analytics company. We are now in 12 different kind of regions, the latest ones being Tokyo and Sao Paulo. Power market analytics is all that these 600 plus experts do. And grid constraints and curtailment is a topic that the team has invested a lot of time analyzing over the last 6 months. It's a topic that we think will be absolutely relevant, probably one of the most relevant drivers of value going forward. So it's an area in where we're also investing and plan to invest a lot of time in the future. So delighted to be here. As Miguel said, I wanted to just start with kind of some of the basics in terms of what is kind of curtailment, and then go into a little bit more of the details. And Alexandre, who is our expert on this subject matter, will do that. So in terms of curtailment and what it is, I think there's often some confusion around what we mean by curtailment. There are two types of curtailment, or at least two types that kind of market advisors like ourselves kind of refer to. There's economic curtailment, and then there's grid curtailment. Grid curtailment is what we will be focusing on today, but I wanted to kind of start with a definition of both of them. So what's economic curtailment? Economic curtailment is effectively referring to a reduction or a restriction of electricity generation from a power plant for economic reasons. What does that mean? It means that if the price in the market is below your variable cost as a generator, you will choose not to generate, or the system operator will choose not to dispatch you because you're out of merit, or in your case, if you're making the decision, because you would lose money as a result. Now, the price at which a generator will curtail will obviously depend on its variable cost, but it will also depend on the structure of its revenues. So obviously, generators where higher variable costs will curtail first. But there's also a nuance that even though it doesn't apply in Spain as much, it applies in other markets, which is that Generators that receive a feed-in tariff, a fixed feed-in tariff based on generation, may choose to still generate regardless of the price because their economic signal is not the market price, is the feed-in tariff that they're receiving. Just to kind of, again, make clear how market advisors think about these things. Economic curtailment is typically included in market price projections. It's included both in terms of how we think about the total volumes of generation. So you will often see a percentage of curtailment that's expected over time, but often you will also see an impact in prices as well, which are often reported in with the data books that are shared. Now, the one we're talking about today and the one that's a bit more difficult is grid curtailment. Now, grid curtailment happens because the system needs a certain amount of energy at different points in the grid to operate safely. And Alexander will explain this technically in a technically correct kind of way. But effectively, what it means is that when there's constraints on the local grid, then further energy can't be injected into that local grid. And so assets need to turn down and physically can't export their energy. Grid curtailment often happens when there's a lot of production locally and when there's not a lot of demand. And so we'll talk a little bit about those drivers in this webinar. Whether kind of curtailment is compensated or not depends broadly on the rules of the market, and in Spain specifically, it depends on when it happens. And again, Alexander will cover this in detail. Now, grid curtailment is not typically included as part of the base case kind of revenue projections from market advisors. So there's a significant difference there because the challenge with this is that curtailment is at a local level. In a market like Spain, in where prices are on a whole country level, then it's not reflected in prices. And so this is something we can discuss. And if you have any questions, then obviously let me know. So that's just kind of to set the scene on kind of what we're talking about when we talk about curtailment. Now, I mentioned that the reason for grid curtailment is kind of congestion in the grid and local grid issues. So I wanted to start with just giving you a picture under numeral 1 of how congestion management costs have increased. This is Red Eléctrica and the cost of managing the grid from Red Eléctrica since January 2021. And you can see that there has been a significant increase in the cost, both day ahead and real time, over the last kind of couple of years. Some of it was related to prices, which is shown in the line in the line on the first graph on the top left, but not all of it is. You can see that even as prices have come down, congestion costs have continued to increase. Now, part of how Red Eléctrica manages the grid, so part of those congestion costs, relates to the curtailment of renewables, as I mentioned before. And so under numeral 2, we can see how much non-compensated curtailment. So this is the times that Red Eléctrica tells a renewable asset not to generate, and it's not compensating it for it. You can see how much that has increased in the last couple of years. So more than 1.05 terawatt hours was curtailed in 2022, and a slightly higher number has already been curtailed in 2023 up to the October number. So obviously curtailment will increase in 2023 compared to 22 when we get to the end of the year. And just to give you a comparison of the overall cost that this represents. So according to the latest network development plan from Red Eléctrica, this is 2021 to 2026, investment in grid investment will be about 1.9 billion, while the congestion costs for the last 3 years have already been 3.6 billion. So this is a significant cost to the system, and even kind of investments in the grid in the grid pale in comparison to what this costs represent. There are other challenges, particularly around the fact that renewable assets can be developed a lot quicker than grid reinforcements can be made. And this is really where we think the issue is going forward. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of to set the scene as well, I just wanted to give a brief overview of congestion at a more kind of global level. Now, congestion is not unique. Grid congestion is not unique to the Spanish market. In fact, I would say that it's a problem that got to Spain later than it did to other European markets. It's been a significant issue in the UK, in where a lot of the wind generation is concentrated in the north, in Scotland, and getting that energy to the load areas in the south hasn't been possible. So there's a lot of congestion in that line. And of course, there's also been a lot of congestion in Germany. And so these have been issues that have been discussed across Europe. The way congestion is managed in different markets varies quite significantly. At one end of that extreme, you have nodal pricing. So nodal pricing is not applicable in Europe. No, nobody's doing it, but it is very much in other markets like in the US. And what nodal pricing means is that dispatch and prices are determined at a nodal level. And so that means that congestion is embedded within the price signals. Kind of further on the other hand, you have kind of zonal pricing, which would be the equivalent of splitting, for example, Spain into not thousands of nodes, but a few zones. This is what has been discussed in Germany, for example. So slightly more locational signals. In comparison, the only locational signal that you have now in Spain is this technical restrictions market. It's the only local or localized market in Spain at the moment. So that's it in terms of the overview of the market, and I'll pass it on to Alexandre to go into a little bit more of the details in Spain.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So I will now talk a little bit more about the specificity of the Spanish grid curtailment and understand in which context basically Spanish grid curtailment happened. And so basically talking about Spain, Red Eléctrica has a market called the technical restriction market, which is an ancillary services in which like Red Eléctrica will solve any grid constraint, and I will define that later on. So you have the definition on the left part of the slide, where basically we see the definition of what we call technical restriction. This technical restriction happened at 2 times of the day, so basically just after the day ahead dispatch and in real time, meaning at any point in the day, in order to be sure that basically the grid is secure. And afterwards, the question is, why do we use a technical restriction market? And there are 3 categories currently, 3 main categories that are important to think about. The first one is voltage control. That is less of an issue for basically renewable curtailment, but it's basically when you miss some reactive power and that the system needs more or less of it. It seems that Red Eléctrica wants to extract this requirement from the technical restriction market, because they started doing like other market on the side. The most important part of it, of the technical restriction market, is the thermal constraint. And what do I mean by thermal constraint? I mean enough load in base case. So when the grid is like full, or when the TSO, so Red Eléctrica, will basically try to see if one of the elements in the grid can basically trip without having whole of Spain in a blackout. So that's the way Red Eléctrica will manage the grid, and that's also why we see renewable being curtailed in Spain currently. There is also a third category, which is called insufficient reserve capacity, that is apparent, seems to be used when basically you don't have enough energy in the balancing market. As explained, there are like 2 different timestamps. The day-ahead market is divided into 2 parts. First, Red Eléctrica will solve the issue, so by basically ramping up some of the thermal asset. That's currently how they do that, so CCGT and coal in the past. Or afterwards redispatch down, so curtailing renewable generation or other type of technology, but it's mainly renewable. And this is not a generation curtailment that is compensated. So it's really where I would say curtailment happen, and why it is so important is because basically you don't get back your money. Afterwards, the phase 2 is more like re-establishing like the supply and demand. basically, if you go downward, that will be also compensated. So it's less of an issue if you are redispatched downward, so curtail in that market. And afterwards, you have the real time in which the volume are way lower, but basically you are partly compensated. The main focus, it's definitely on the day ahead phase one downward, where basically most of the curtailment happened. But now that we explain basically what is the framework for it, we will try to see basically where does this curtailment happen. And what you can see on this different maps is the curtailment happening on the left for solar PV, in the middle for solar thermal, and on the right for wind, onshore wind, currently in Spain. And all these data is for the full year 2022, and that we basically find on Red Electrica website, and afterwards map the different plants on the Spanish map. So what you can see is that when you look more in detail about like where this curtailment happening, is that for solar PV you have like 3 main regions, being like Cáceres, Badajoz, and Ciudad Real. So basically Extremadura, the left of Madrid, where you have more than 50 gigawatt hour. What is also interesting to understand is that to understand basically what part of the total solar generation was actually curtailed. Because if you have like 50 gigawatt hour of curtailment, but you have like a lot more of solar generation, it doesn't matter. At the end, it's the percentage of curtailment that matter. And it's what you can see on the lower part of the graph, where basically Badajoz and Ciudad Real exceed 2.5% of curtailment, averaging like 3%, if I'm not mistaken. So what you can see in the middle is solar thermal, and what we saw in 2022 is that it was one of the most curtailed generation. Like basically looking at the percentage, it completely exceeds the legend that we put here, because some of the province were curtailed like 18% of the time. So Ciudad Real, for example, and 9% of the total generation of solar thermal was curtailed in 2022, which is really massive. Afterwards, looking at wind, we see that Zaragoza and A Coruña are the 2 main touched by curtailment, I would say, but in terms of percentages, it's slightly lower than solar PV and solar thermal. So yeah, it's definitely something to take into account, like the percentage of curtailment, because it's what at the end will hit the bottom line of your project. So now that we looked at it from a I would say geographical perspective, let's look at it from a time perspective. So what you can see on these 2 graphs are still like when the non-compensated curtailment happened, that they had non-compensated curtailment. And on the upper part of the graph, what you can see is that the volume is basically the stack in gigawatt hour. And afterwards, we will look at the capture price, the different lines that we see, but I will comment that later on. So what we clearly see is that there is a clear seasonality about curtailment happening for many reasons. Like I would say 3 reasons. The first one is that generation of renewable is way lower in winter, or at least solar and solar thermal. Afterwards, the demand also increase, and also the capacity of the line will increase during the winter, meaning that as you put like electricity in a line, it will eat up. And if you have a lot of wind and also a cold temperature, the line will basically be able to have like more electricity flowing into the line. So they have like bigger capacity during the winter. What is clear here is that seasonality happened. Solar PV, solar thermal, and onshore wind were quite equal. Solar thermal seems to basically have disappeared this year. And if we look now at the lines that I just mentioned before, you see the plain line is the capture price, and the dotted line is the weighted average price of curtailment. So in other words, saying when you were curtailed, at which price the day-ahead market was. And what you can see is that what you would think normally is that these kind of weighted average price of curtailment would be lower than your capture price, because it's really when you have full capitalization that it would happen. And it seems to be the case in the latest month. Nonetheless, what we see in July 2022, which was like the biggest month in terms of curtailment, is that it's the opposite. So basically, you were curtailed when basically prices were high, which seems a bit weird. And the reason is it's definitely due to the gas price cap in Spain, where basically we saw that price were growing a little bit up, like at 12.1. So basically increasing basically the curtailment in times where basically normally you have a bigger cannibalization due to increase of generation of gas CCGT at those periods. Now looking at the hourly profile, not much to say, to be honest. Solar is curtailed during solar hours. There is a small reduction at 8, 9, where basically you have slightly more generation, but afterwards wind is kind of curtailed during the whole period. So there is, I would say, also showing that there's nothing to say is also a finding. So that would be it for giving a bit more insight in terms of location, understanding how that works, and timing also of when the curtailment happened.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. I think it was very insightful and short. So thank you, because it's not easy to summarize this complex issue in so many slides. One thing we were starting to get some questions from the audience, and one maybe is a very basic one, but Anna, you talked about economic and grid curtailment, but there was a question about whether in fact the absence of demand or curtailment given or because of absence of demand is also part of grid curtailment, or should we think about this issue in a different way?
Yeah, I would think about it in the context of is it self-scheduled curtailment, or is it kind of Red Eléctrica telling you that you cannot generate? I think that's the way I would think about it. So by self-schedule, I mean either your bid into kind of the market is at a price that's above the market price, in which case you are out of merit, or you decide not to bid, or whatever the case might be, because the prices are too low. That to me is kind of economic curtailment. Anything that is then a result of kind of grid constraints, it's what we would call grid curtailment. Now, it's not to say that when you may have periods of low demand in where prices are low, and you also have local grid constraints, and so both of them can happen at the same time. But I think there is a distinction in terms of whether it's self-scheduled or you're told that you cannot export into the grid.
Okay. You also presented a figure in which it was very clear how curtailment became an issue last year and this year, and we assume that also in 2024. How should developers think about this? I mean, can this be somewhat forecasted given what has already happened, or it's hard to predict how this is going to behave going forward?
I'll let Alexander answer that. I mean, basically, this is what we have been doing, is looking at how this evolves. So Alexander, maybe you can provide some insights into that.
Yeah, so in order to think about like I would say grid curtailment, you need to look at the three driver of it. So you would have like demand and demand in different region in Spain, and also definitely supply, and at the end basically the grid curtailment. So basically what we need to understand in order to know where the curtailment arises is like where you will have an excess of generation that you need to like bring back to a center of demand, like basically like the example about the UK that Anna was mentioning before. And if you look at the map that we just discussed just before, we see that Badajoz, Ciudad Real, or basically Zaragoza for wind are places where you have a lot of supply that needs to be brought back towards like center of demand, because they are also places where demand is not that high. So Definitely, there is a way to forecast that, is basically to look at the evolution of like the supply and demand in each province, and how they will evolve. If basically you will get more supply, and then you need to use more extensively the grid towards Madrid, for example, or in Zaragoza towards Barcelona, in order to meet your demand. So basically, if you create like a view on your supply at the provincial level and on your demand at the provincial level as well, you will be able to make some assumption or how these curtailment will evolve in time.
Okay. In terms of compensation, I mean, and mainly as or in the short term, mostly, because as Anna was saying, there might be a solution to this at some point. We will talk about some of the developments, but do you see a way or a system or mechanism by which projects are compensated by this type of curtailment?
So to explain, so basically you will have like three kind of curtailment, which is like the first one in the head phase one. This one you don't have any compensation. Afterwards, but basically it's structural. So basically, if you sold your energy towards the day-ahead market and you've built a hotel at that time, you cannot like resell it afterwards because you are like constraining the grid. Afterwards, if you look at the day-ahead phase two, and basically you decide to curtail yourself in order to help the grid, this is something that you can do, and also to earn some money from it. We understood that from some client that they are doing these kind of playing around with different market that they have at their disposal. And afterwards, if we look at real-time curtailment, this is like, I would say, partly compensated. So basically you will earn like 15% of the day-ahead prices as we speak, because like the rules are also reworked. Quite recently there was a public consultation on technical restriction ending like end of September or something like that, and I know that there are still discussion on it. So definitely something to look at.
Okay. Do you think there will be a European solution to this, or each country and system will work on its own solution?
Yeah, I will. So basically, I do think like congestion management is extremely local. When we look at basically the technical restriction market is extremely specific to Spain. Everyone has their way to deal with it. Like Germany has a different way than France or even the UK. So I don't see in the regulation that the European Commission has put forward, and Acer, the regulator, the European regulator, I didn't see anything in that sense. At least some improvement in terms of how to better handle the grid, but not like a kind of structured market as we have for Mari or Picasso for the balancing market, I would say. So even if they start to think about that now, it could be like in 10 years. So I would say that yeah, not a short-term alignment, I would say.
Okay. You showed a very useful map, no, regarding the different provinces in Spain. How static is this map? So should I be concerned if I'm in one of these provinces with high curtailment? Would this change? Is this the footprint that I should use to go and request my interconnection point?
Yeah.
So
Go for it.
Okay. So basically, currently we have like 2 years of data as well. So it's if we look in the past, basically with real data, we will see that these provinces stay quite similar. So we saw also like basically the three solar provinces that I mentioned, and also Zaragoza. We see some other province like popping up, but structurally they seem to be like in those four provinces, like something to look at. Obviously, there are some change that will happen going forward, and it's also what we try to model at Aurora is the development of demand, and especially the flexibility of the demand. So basically, if you have like, and by flexibility, I would think about like two main things. I would see like electrical vehicle that will help quite a bit. Afterwards, as well, like hydrogen, like if hydrogen is also capturing part of the demand from renewable in places where there is no demand or low demand, as the places that we just showed, that would help quite a bit. And afterwards, the supply as well, because like we're talking always about more renewable, but there are some technology that will decrease in terms of generation. And by those, I mean nuclear, obviously nuclear phase out. And you saw that there is a lot of curtailment in Cáceres. There are two nuclear power plants there, so you can imagine that if they come to a phase out in 2027, 2028, and 2029, it would greatly change the behavior. As well, gas CCGT, so basically the number of hours that those plants are producing electricity. Despite having still a lot of capacity in Spain, if they produce less, to basically use as well the grid less, leaving some space for more renewable. So these are the kind of thing that the factor and driver that we need to look at in the future to forecast these kind of curtailment. So basically, currently on the short term, yes, you might be concerned. You might also want to have a look at the development plan of Red Electrica, understanding if they really plan to do something about the problem that you are facing or that you plan to face if you see that you're already curtailed. Yeah, that would be I would say, the different part of the equation that I would put on the table.
Yeah, and at the risk of stating the obvious, the provinces or the areas in where we see the most issues are obviously the ones in which you would need to assume a pretty significant change from now to be able to mitigate that, right? So I do think there's for example, we know that Zaragoza has a lot of kind of curtailment issues, not just from our analysis, that's just a known fact. And so we think that can be mitigated, but you need to make some pretty important assumptions around the growth of kind of demand in the form of hydrogen, for example, and also grid reinforcements that are already significantly delayed in this part of the country, right? So, yeah, as Alexander said, it's a good picture of how it evolves, how it is now. It can change, but obviously you need to make some pretty big assumptions as to what changes in order to completely flip the picture.
Okay. I mean, you both briefly touch on demand issues, no? Because we often focused on the supply, but not that much on the demand, no? And obviously, curtailment may be affected in a positive, hopefully, way because of demand triggers, no? And you mentioned two, but I would like to get your thoughts on whether these two are the key ones. No? You mentioned hydrogen and you mentioned electric vehicles. Are these the two issues or aspects or items that may drive demand and curtailment from the demand side going forward?
Yes. So basically, I do think so, also because I did the math about it and see that it has quite a big impact. The third one that maybe we can touch upon later on as well is not really demand, but it's like shifting demand thanks to batteries. That will basically, if you charge during solar hours and then dispatch at non-solar hours in places like Badajoz, I think it's quite obvious that curtailment will go lower. So that's, I would say, the three big categories. You can think about heat pumps, but afterwards we understand that it's not that flexible, and also like base demand industry, etc. It will be more difficult to change that. So for electrical vehicle, I don't think we can do much about like where they charge and in which province they charge. It's based on population. I don't think we will change that in Spain. For electrolyzer, there is a big question on where do you locate them, and with like the big plans that the Spanish government has, so 4 gigawatts in the past, or at least the current view, and 11 in this draft PNIEC. there is a big question of where do you put it. So because basically when you think about hydrogen, you need to think about different part of it. You need to be close to the demand. As we speak, there is no infrastructure. And afterwards, you need also to take these kind of consideration going forward. Third one, you also have like this view of having a hydrogen backbone. So you would want to be also close to that backbone going for further. So yeah, that's a equation with a lot of unknown, but I do think like curtailment and also it is definitely part of it. In order to be sure that you locate your electrolyzer in the right places.
Okay. We have another maybe more technical question on the SRAP, the Sistema de Reducción Automática de Potencia. Can you please elaborate on this and assess or tell us if you see any chances of this becoming a partial mitigant to curtailment?
So it is. It reduced quite a bit the curtailment for a lot of clients when we discuss with them. So just to understand what is it? So you made the Spanish the definition. What does that mean in reality? It means that so basically how Red Eléctrica will handle the grids is that how they do I would say. So first of all, to start with, we need to understand that a basic principle of power system is that you need to be able to lose any element at any point in time without having like the system to crash. That's the basic of it. And you have two ways to go on with it. You basically can do preventive action. So you know that you can have an issue and you will do something the day before. So it's why we saw so much day ahead curtailment in the past. And afterwards, there is another way, which is like the curative N-1. So basically, if an event occur, and basically, luckily, like losing a line in the grid doesn't happen every day. At that moment, if Red Eléctrica knows that they have other asset that they can curtail or that they can redispatch up in terms of CCGT, they will be able to let more flow on the grid. And it's exactly what we're talking about. So if you do like a strap mechanism, if you basically make the agreement with Red Eléctrica in order to have the strap implemented on your assets, it means that you need to be able to, if Red Eléctrica needs it, to redispatch down or curtail your generation, at least for renewable. It can be in the other direction for hydro or CCGT. But at that moment, basically, what it changes is that it will help the grid because like Red Eléctrica will know that they have more capacity to flow like this renewable. Nonetheless, it doesn't change if you have like a structural bottleneck. So basically, if even looking at the base case, or if you have all your line, you have problems, you will still have problem whatever the strap is. So that's really important to understand. And we saw these kind of base case overload as well. And also technically, what does that change in the curtailment risk? Is the fact that the only part of the merit order in terms of curtailment that we know from Red Eléctrica is that if you don't have the strap implemented, you are above the one that have the strap implemented. So basically, as a temporary thing, you can implement the strap and be below your neighbors that will be curtailed going forward. Afterwards, it doesn't mean that going at the end, we assume that at the point everyone will be under strap. That would make sense. Nonetheless, I do think that even if everyone is in the strap, that will let more flow on the grid. So it's still a good thing. It will improve basically the amount of renewable and generation that the grid can handle. I hope it.
Okay.
And the last small point is that we saw that from 2022 to 2023, solar thermal is not curtailed anymore. And basically, when we look at August 2023, the percentage of solar thermal in the under strap is 95%. So basically, it means that being curtailed like 9% of the generation, and then the year after they were like, yeah, maybe we should do something about it, and implemented the swap on all their assets. So that's a cool fact, I would say.
Okay, so they're instruments. We still don't know whether they bring more uncertainty or hopefully certainty, but there are other aspects, no, to consider. There's a question on PPAs, no, and whether, according to your experience, this curtailment risk is being taken by the producer, by the offtaker, or somehow is embedded in the price. Do you have any thoughts or any feedback on this matter?
Yeah, it very much depends on the PPA kind of structure. So this wasn't a significant issue before, and so I think it was probably overlooked a little bit. But even within what I would say, payment for production structures, you have pay as produced, pay as nominated. And who bears the risk of curtailment between those two structures is different, right? So that's something that you want to look at carefully when defining your PPA is it based on what I nominated on the day-ahead market? In which case you as a generator are covered because you nominated that, and then whatever happens in the outturn is not necessarily your risk, or whether it's pay as produced, and in which case the meter generation will not be there if you're curtailed. So it's very much in the structure of the PPAs, and something that I know clients are looking a lot more closely at now.
Okay. On small projects, we also see some investors focusing on less than 5 megawatt install capacity projects, as these are with, or they have a much lower risk of curtailment. Is it the case that you see larger PV plants at higher risk of curtailment, or size does not matter?
Yeah, so we do see that basically the higher you are in the different voltage, I would say, the higher the curtailment as well. I'm not sure that it's basically how Red Electrica works as well. We see some curtailment happening in the distribution network, but quite a little part of it from at the end the data that are published to us. And we also had some clients mentioning that they had basically plants connected to the 400 kV at the exact same node, and also plants at the 220, and basically they were much more curtailed at 400s. So definitely there is something in that I would say in that sense. Afterwards, there is also a question on is it due to transparency on the data, or basically we know where this curtailment happened, as we mentioned. It seems to have that we have a little bit of volume in distribution network in order to solve some issue, but like going forward, like with a lot of distributed solar, there might be a question of why wouldn't it happen at a more localized level, and the question is more, do we have the data to see it? And this I cannot answer in terms of transparency. It's also something that I've been fighting for the last 6 months, in order to basically see like where this curtailment happened. Do we know the location of all the plant, etc., which substation are they connected to, etc. That's not something that easy, at least currently, and I would think that in the future we would need more transparency on these curtailment going forward.
Okay. Self-consumption. This is also a topic that is pervasive in the news. And how do you think this should affect, or this will affect the curtailment of plants?
So basically, as I explained in the past, like the way these kind of curtailment happen is also when basically you try to transport some electricity from some place quite further away towards like the demand. So basically places where you have space towards places where you have demand. Thinking about Badajoz towards Madrid, for example. If you put it like directly on the rooftop of Madrid, basically you will also kind of slightly decrease these kind of problems. So basically, if you make it more localized, you might have less problem in terms of flow over the transmission line. That's the first point. After is the other problem that you might like unfold is like, is the distribution and really small voltage lines are able to handle those kind of new distributed solar. That's a question that I have little information on. More focus on like the high voltage, but it's a problem that also is in any like European country. We see that distribution network has never been built to have like that much decentralized flow, especially if everyone is like producing at solar hours, which is not the case for the transmission network that will be more stable, I would say.
Yeah, this is probably a whole different topic for another seminar, probably. Well, one last question before we close on batteries, not this assets. How do you see the development of these assets, given some of the uncertainties, at least in Spain, around the regulatory framework, and whether you see a coherent strategy? Because, as you said, there are a lot of local issues around curtailment, and this should demand from the operator a coherent strategy, which is not always the case, unfortunately. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And Alexandre, please feel free to jump in. So when we think about batteries, I think there's probably kind of two sets of objectives from developers. One is the revenue of the battery itself, so the revenue stack that you can achieve by operating your battery in the different markets available in Spain. And then the other one, which it's probably very important in Spain, probably more so than in other regions, is the mitigation of the risk for assets like solar. So when we think about the first kind of business kind of strategy, the reality is that, you know, we do see kind of the IRR of batteries in some cases, in some configurations, being good enough for a significant number of developers and IPPs to consider them. You need to be very comfortable with merchant risk. Because what you're banking on is arbitrage opportunities in the day ahead, tertiary replacement reserve markets, and some secondary reserve revenues. There's probably an upside from capacity payments, which, as you know, we have a little bit more clarity on now. But then there's a lot as well in kind of just mitigating the risk of solar. And I think this is in the analysis that we've done. Obviously, the biggest investment risk to solar is more solar, and the biggest mitigant to that risk is storage. And so even though you don't necessarily need to collocate a storage asset to mitigate the risk, because, you know, from a pricing perspective, it shouldn't necessarily matter where you are, there's two important considerations. The first is that you probably don't want to wait if you have a big solar portfolio for somebody else to build the batteries if you're concerned about cannibalization risk. And then the other is that the grid curtailment element, it does make sense to collocate, right? Because it doesn't make sense to have a storage asset in one part of the country and a battery in another one. You need to be able to mitigate the grid curtailment. And so that's kind of what we see in terms of kind of the business case. So there's both of those. You can, of course, combine them, and we do when we analyze this in terms of the benefits of storage. But I do agree, there's some kind of lack of clarity that is completely detrimental to the development of this much needed capacity in Spain. One of them is it's one of the only markets in Europe where you don't have a primary reserve market. This is where batteries make the most money in other European countries, and it's a market that doesn't exist in Spain. That limits the economics of batteries, and it means that less developers will be willing to invest in them compared to other countries in Europe. And then the other one is the remuneration for batteries in the technical restrictions market themselves. There's a lot of talk about, the fact that batteries can provide voltage control, for example, and they can do that without the necessity to generate kind of energy, which means that you don't have to pay an expensive CCGT, kind of the cost of energy for providing voltage control. But there's no clarity about the remuneration that a battery would get in that scheme. So I think those things are quite detrimental to the development of the technology, even though there's 13 gigawatts of projects in the pipeline. I think the lack of clarity around this is slowing down investment quite significantly.
Right. Is there any figures on how, I guess, United Kingdom is the most advanced country, no, in implementing batteries? And correct me if I'm wrong. Have you seen or there is any data on the impact that the development of batteries have had in the system, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's hard to, and Alexander, please feel free to jump in again. It's hard to generalize. Obviously, the UK system is a very different system. It's not a solar dominated system, right? And so it's kind of local issues that batteries are playing a bigger role in, as opposed to mitigating kind of solar cannibalization, because you have wind generation as a dominant technology in the UK. It's the same case in Ireland, which is also a very kind of advanced battery market, I would say. I think the key learning from those markets is that they have managed to define the needs of the system in a granular enough way that you can then compensate technologies like storage that are able to provide those services in the cheapest way possible. Right, so they have defined the need for frequency response as a market, not as a non-remunerated service, as is the case of Spain. And they've defined the need for very quick responses in the system more generally, in where batteries have been dominant. And so I think that's the learning is, we know we have operability issues that we will need to manage. We need to define what those are, and then we can define a market that provides for that. And I'm sure storage will take a significant role in those markets if done properly.
Yeah, maybe to also look at a market that I'm looking at as well, looking at France, where you have like a lot of nuclear, a lot of interconnection, and also hydro. Basically, you would assume, okay, why do I need battery? And as Anna mentioned, the primary reserve is liberalized. They have a capacity market, and we see 700 megawatt already installed battery capacity in the market, when Spain has 5, if I'm not mistaken, as we speak. So I'm not saying that the growth would be bigger in France. I would say even the opposite than Spain. But it's also showing that you need to basically liberalize those markets. That's the whole principle of a battery, is to do like stacking of different markets. And if they don't have access to those, they cannot make it happen. And basically also shifting the prices when you have those curtailment, helping the grid like integrating more renewable.
Excellent. Well, I think with this we come to the close of the seminar. We exceeded our time. We want to be strict about this 45 minutes, but I have to say that we got tons of questions. We have some others that we could not answer. But Anna, Alexandra, thank you very much for this very insightful seminar. We will share a video of the session for all the attendees to review, and obviously happy to be in touch for this or any other topic. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thanks, Miguel.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.